Hello, beautiful community. It's the beginning of 2025. So, what does that mean? It means it's time for Mr. Patrushev, the hawk of hawks, as Margalioti calls him, to offer Kremlin's ideological vision for 2025. Now, what's staggering about his vision is its combination of ideological fervor with unbelievable passivity. Like, what do you want, Mr. Patrushev? For global forces to deliver us what we need? What do you have to offer, Mr. Patrushev? Well, that could be worked out once global forces transform the world sufficiently, and then we'll see. So it's a kind of, if you like, proactive resignation where you're working, but where you're going and where you're going to land is going to be, fingers crossed, an outcome of only partly mappable global forces washing you up somewhere. And so what is that? That's a statement of one of the three central pillars of Kremlin ideology, which is the mysticism that says that somehow Russia can be propelled from the back row to the front row of nations. Here is Mr. Patrushev's interview in the original in Komsomolskaya Pravda. Let's look at some of the key claims Mr. Patrushev makes. He says the US is still a power that the world very much looks to. And here you have to understand that it's not a project of the Kremlin to make America powerless. It's a project of the Kremlin to somehow bring it about that Russia is much more powerful relative to the United States, and that the United States is dismissed from certain kinds of influence that undermine the Kremlin's capacity to sustain regime security, right? So foreign policy and domestic policy are linked. Patrushev says the American elite itself is divided and doesn't have a unified vision of how precisely to shape policy, both globally and domestically. What do we say? Unfortunately, Mr. Patrushev is correct here. He talks about a changing world. Today we're witnessing serious change across the world. I'm referring not only to the geopolitical situation, but also to the state of the economy, technological development, and social and cultural processes. And this is as significant a crossroads as the time when the USSR collapsed. He goes on. Biden's presidency demonstrated that the priorities of the White House and of ordinary citizens differed significantly. So he is pointing to the simmering crisis of legitimacy in Western democracies that the Russians are keen to over-exaggerate, identify, truthfully, but then over-exaggerate and then deleteriously influence. Ordinary Americans, he says, will accept ideas that might help their prosperity. They'll welcome measures that support family values, improve healthcare, and address wildfires and illegal immigration. Then he gets to the subject of Trump's co-option, right? Time will tell whether Trump can fully implement his intentions. As his first term showed, the notorious deep state in the United States is very strong. So here, our analysis, my analysis of Trump's first term predicament does rather overlap with the Kremlin's analysis. That's to say that they felt that Trump was spectacularly co-opted, that he was unable to form an elite around him and therefore advance any kind of project. And Patrushev is wondering how far will it be different this time. He says it's clear that there's a big divergence between what many US elites want and what Trump wants. And therefore, he says it's extremely important to keep Trump safe in the days until he takes power. Now, that doesn't mean that they're all in on Trump. That doesn't mean that they know what's going to come. They don't. And they have a feeling at once of cautious optimism and significant skepticism. He says that Ukraine will be less important for Trump. For the Biden administration, Ukraine was an unconditional priority. Clearly, relations between Trump and the Biden administration are antagonistic. Therefore, Ukraine will not be amongst Trump's priorities. He'll be more concerned about China. He says that speculation that Trump will send armed forces to conquer new states for the US, while in line with the history of US intervention across the globe, can hardly be justified, can hardly be seen as realistic. Then he comes to his obscurantist threats. Discrimination against the Russian population must stop in a number of countries, particularly in the Baltics and in Moldova. The authorities of these states are plunging themselves into a profound crisis with reckless actions. I don't rule out that Moldova's aggressive anti-Russian policy may lead to the country either becoming part of another state or ceasing to exist altogether. Now, that again is a reference to sort of global forces washing something up. He's not saying that the Russians are going to bring it about, that Moldova doesn't exist. He goes on, territories once governed. So here he's talking about the possible deal with Trump. Territories once governed by Ukraine now join the Russian Federation according to the Russian constitution, and there can be no question about that. So here he is lying and is aware that there is no chance that Russia will get all the territories that it doesn't control, that it put in their constitution. He also knows that no Ukrainian government could recognize the legitimacy of the territories Russia controls as Russian, because that would create political chaos in Ukraine. Ukraine can say, well, look, we went trying to regain these territories militarily, potentially as part of a deal, but Ukraine certainly cannot say these territories are Russian. If it were to, it would become ungovernable. He goes on, the forces that impose the neo-Nazi ideology and rabid Russophobia are destroying once thriving Ukrainian cities like Kharkiv, Odessa, Mykolaiv, and Dnepropetrovsk. So he is getting involved here in a clash of nationalisms in Ukraine. And indeed, people have in Kharkiv and Odessa grievances with certain models of nationalism that they feel are being projected onto them. But that's a matter of internal domestic politics in Ukraine, in the sense that nobody who has grievances with certain nationalist narratives in Ukraine wants to join Mr. Patrushev, right? Whatever grievances there may be, nobody thinks Mr. Patrushev has anything to offer, or the Kremlin has anything to offer. So it's a kind of an 80% deceptive statement with a grain of truth in it. He then says it's possible that Ukraine will cease to exist altogether this year. Now, what does that mean? He obviously doesn't mean biological disappearance of Ukrainians. He means that Ukraine could cease to exist as a state. Well, so could Russia. It's extremely unlikely to be the case in the case of both countries in 2025. But this is one of the difficulties we have, right, with these conversations. Well, wouldn't it be good? Many folks in the pro-Ukrainian internet feel if Russia disappeared and broke up into small pieces, well, that in itself doesn't guarantee anything good for Ukraine. It could, but it just depends on what happens in Ukraine at the same time. Negotiations. I believe that negotiations on Ukraine should be held between Russia and the United States without the involvement of other Western countries. And what he's laying out here is a claim about subjecthood that Trump could never accept. That's to say that Ukraine should play no part in any possible negotiations. They should be not with Ukraine, but about Ukraine with the United States. Now, Ukraine has a contrary, diametrically opposed position that you shouldn't negotiate with Putin about a deal, that the deal should be something that's negotiated between Ukraine and the West, and then it's just shared with the Russians who accept it or reject it. And Trump's in a position where he's not seeing either side. He wants both sides, either side's claim. He wants both sides to be involved in the negotiation. Now, we will discuss this in more detail when I talk about Putin's biggest fears in terms of the very process, let alone a possible outcome of negotiations with Trump on the main channel. But what's the big picture takeaway from here, in my view? I think the big picture takeaway isn't just the point about how Russia has nothing to offer that it can articulate. Mr. Patrushev can't articulate anything he's offering here. But also how little agency Mr. Patrushev attributes to Russia and to himself, right? That what he's after here isn't about a projection of Russian power to achieve concrete aims, but a kind of a hope that there will be a deliverance from Russia from the challenges it faces and can't resolve by a set of global forces that are in a particular kind of wash and should hopefully, must, maybe, deliver Russia what it needs, which Russia doesn't yet know. And that way Russian power can be extended. That's to say that this is a kind of a mystical idea, devoid from concrete account of agency, full of magical thinking about the projection of Russia from the back row to the front row of nations, via a partly true observation about Western democratic decline and the chaotic nature of the international system. So, this porridge, this global porridge, will give us something, though we don't know what it is, and will help us project ourselves positively, even though we don't know how we want to be projected. So, staggering passivity, right, as well as an incapacity to offer anything to the world. Lots of love.